Okay, so in this video I'm going to show you how to add complexity to an existing animation that you've done. So like if you get changes from me or from anybody else, how you go about tackling that. And there's actually a couple of different tools in Maya for doing that. And in this video I'll show you how to use animation layers and how to use the graph editor. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm just doing a play blast to evaluate the animation and look for the area that needs to be evaluated. And I think it's very important that you always play blast so you get an actual proper time, 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second, but an actual proper playback of what your animation is supposed to look like. And so here I see the ball bouncing, and I identify exactly where I want to take it. So that little part where it spins around and it builds up momentum for bouncing, I'm going to add a little figure skater kind of circle so it builds up some momentum while preserving the angular momentum from the bouncing. And so here I'm looking at the graph editor and I'm looking to identify where those bounces kind of go wrong and what can I delete to then come in and add some more appropriate motion for that spin. And so this is just a matter of looking at the graph, and here I see I've got two bounces that are nearly identical, and this tells me that this is probably where I'm going to cut, because if you've got two identical bounces you've got some redundancy there. So I've got two sets of identical bounces, so it looks like I'm going to cut from 123 to 152. Just delete those out of there and then clamp that keyframe down so that that's not another bounce but it's a straight line, so we stay on the ground there. And those two bounces going into it, those will need some correction too. And here I'm just checking to see how the contact is made. And I'm going to break those tangents because right now like there's a little bit of an ease end to the bounce that I want to prevent. So I'm going to go ahead and just take care of that right now. Just clean up my work beforehand. Break tangents, weighted tangents. Get that nice sharp momentum back out. Alright, so now the next thing to do is to add the little circle rolling motion of the ball. As it's on the ground here, it's going to spin around in a little circle and then take back up off again, using that momentum to then continue its bounce up there. It looks like I've got some squash that actually needs to be taken out as well. So I'm sorry, this is a voiceover over my first time recording. My recording on this video did not actually capture the audio. So I'm going to do the create an editable motion trail. So I've selected the ball as transform on a squash and stretch, and we're going to draw the actual motion trail in the string by creating an editable motion trail. And this will help us visualize where the ball is going and get an idea of how long it kind of takes it to go there. It lets us see the past and the future. So the red line, the red part of the line is the stuff that's already happened. The blue line is the stuff that's yet to happen. And you can see that the proportion is changing there. So all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to drag these little keyframes here, those little points, and I'm just going to make a little circle out of them, a tight little circle. That will be our little spin. And it's very pointy right now, so I'm going to have to go in here and I'm going to have to add some keyframes. Oh, I'm just showing that I put the environment on a templated layer or reference layer, so I don't risk selecting it. That's very handy when you're doing this because you know if you're selecting the background when you mean to be selecting keys, it's very frustrating. Okay, so that's really pointy there, right? So thinking about our principle of arcs, right? Arcs are one of the very important principles of animation. They're all important, but arcs are being violated here, so I'm going to add some more keyframes and get some more arcs going in. So I just want to do keys, translate X and Z. I'm probably going to key Y there too, it looks like, but that's okay. It doesn't matter really that much. Just by selecting those, adding a key, now I'm starting to get a little more of a smooth motion. Looks a lot better now that it's arcing more. It needs a little more arc, to be honest with you. Let's see if I go through and do that. Yeah, I'm making a better arc there so that it eases out a little bit better. So you see how that keyframe I added transitions to that straight off a little better. This is making sort of like if you look at the motion on the ground, it's actually making a type of a spiral a little bit. And I'm making another keyframe on the ground here to get between these two keys here. I can't see very clearly what it is on the, but yeah, it looks like between keyframe 133 and 134. Probably going to delete 134, or I might keep it. But yeah, sometimes if you do a keyframe on every frame, that's what you got to do to make it do what you want. But no, it looks like I'm going to get rid of it. Nope, I'm going to move it. Give it a little more space so it takes a little bit of time there. So that squash, I'm probably going to leave some squash in there to create a sense of anticipation. I'm not sure if I keep that right there or not, but yeah. So here I'm looking at the curve and I'm following the motion, and I don't like the trajectory that those arcs are making. So I'm trying to work that out a little bit better so that it makes more sense for how it lands, spins around, and then goes up into the next bounce here. Yeah, see that straight line there? There we go. No more straight lines. Straight lines are not really what you want. Nice and arcing now. Sometimes I move the ball out of the way so I can just work on the keyframe. So it's very important too to also understand that the motion path is basically it's the sum of your motion channels, whereas when you're looking at the graph editor, the channels are being presented in isolation. So it can be a little confusing sometimes to be working between the graph editor and the motion path. But frankly, they're both very, very useful tools and are indispensable. Learning how to use both of them is mandatory. That's a must-do. And I'm just spacing these keyframes out to adjust the timing. So I'm paying attention to how many keyframes it takes for each section of the motion and evening it out there. And that ball popping off the ground a little bit there is what caught my eye, so I think I'm probably going to be editing that squash now. Looking at this a second time, I would have edited that squash again. Oh, so the motion trail that I just selected, you can hide that. I just hit Control H to hide it and Shift H to show it again. So if it's bothering you, you just select it and Shift H and Control H and all that. Yeah, so I took it out for the play blast, otherwise it shows up. You can also just delete that and if you don't want it in there anymore and make a new one if you need it later. Alright, so doing a play blast, check the work. Always important that you check your work through a play blast. Okay, so here I'm getting into the squash and stretch of the of this ball right here. This is the squash and stretching that's happening on the ground. I'm just deleting it. And it's still squashed here, so that needs to be brought up to 1. Just moving the keyframes value, changing it from 0.476 to 1. So the ball is no longer squashed on the ground. I'm also tackling all of these things one at a time. So first I got the translation of the ground done, and now I'm fixing the squash. So, and now it looks like I'm going to go into rotation. So another part to adding complexity or making edits is tackling your changes one at a time. I find it much easier to do one set of changes at a time than doing all of them at once. And I'm probably looking at the rotations here. I think that's what I'm looking at because I've got those channels selected. Yep, I'm getting rid of those rotations there because those happen while it's on the ground, and I want to overwrite all that. And I think I used an animation layer to correct this. Yep, I do. Okay, so over on the animation layers, so I'm switching from display layer, so there's display layers right there that handle all of those things that you're familiar with already, and then there's animation layers. So with the ball selected, and I think you actually have to add it afterwards anyway, but yeah, so we need to add an animation layer, which is that little plus sign. And the layers are additive, so it's important that you have a nice clean base to add on top of, which is probably why I deleted all those other keyframes, because that would just, you'd be taking one step forward and 2 steps back if I didn't delete those. So that little plus button right there, select that, that creates 2 animation layers. It creates base animation and animation layer 1. Base animation contains all the existing animation that I already have up to that point, and anim layer 1 is an empty layer for changes, so there's nothing there yet. And even with anim layer 1 selected, it's highlighted, that little green ball, that green ball tells me that what I'm going to be animating, what actually has active animation data on it, or actually has associated objects with it. Right now, nothing is associated with anim layer 1. I actually have to add the ball transform, or the ball rotation, to anim layer 1. So I select both of them, I think I do both of them, and then just right click, add selected objects, and now you see that the green dot is up on anim layer 1, and the red dot is on base animation. And then it swaps when I select them both. So now that tells you that I have an association with that object for that layer, but it's not the current active layer. So make sure you got that green dot if you're going to do anim layer. And it's very important to name your animation layers. The way that animation layers work is that since they're additive, I don't like to do too much on an animation layer. I try to, once again, I tackle one set of motion or one type of motion per layer. So for this layer, we're just going to do ball spin rotation. And I named it appropriately so that I know what I'm looking at, or if someone else is looking at it, or I come back to it a week later, I know what I'm looking at. And not just anim layer 1, anim layer 2, anim layer 3. That will drive you nuts trying to figure out what's going on there. Okay. So with the animation layer selected and active, and you see there's nothing in this channel yet. So what I need to do now is I need to create what are called zero keys, which is just basically I just key the layers on the area that I'm going to key the layer on the channels that I'm going to be working on through the time period I'm selecting. So I keyed my 122, I believe it was, yeah, 123 to 153, and you see how that's a flat line there? So everything before 122 is going to be unedited, and everything after 152 is going to be unedited. And right now, in fact, this whole layer is just, it's kind of zeroed out. It's basically, I've got keyframes that don't have any value. And that's what we want, because we only want to be applying changes to the rotation for this section here. So I'm going to be working between 123 and 152. And I'm going to go ahead and set keyframes in this little segment here, and it's going to add these values to the layer underneath. So that right there, we've got the change happening over the base animation layer through this range of keyframes. It's very important to make sure when you're doing rotations that your underlying rotations have as little going on between them as little rotation variance between them for the area you're working on. Otherwise, when the angles start to add up, it gets very confusing. The Maya uses Euler angle rotations for graph animation like this, and the way that these angles interpolate is not always very intuitive, and sometimes you get some very odd movements if you don't know what to expect. There we go. So yeah, you see how that little it twirls out there, because that's basically we're going back to the keyframes on the base layer, and so it starts to blend back into, as we approach that 0 mark, it starts to go back to what the base animation rotation is. And I'm seeing this rotation's a little bit slow there, and you can see that the velocity of the rotation changes just by looking at the curve. And that little bit where it blends out at the end, it's not totally right, but I'm not sure that it's as big of a problem. I might be able to get away with it. We'll see. The design and the shader on this particular, yeah, so you see how I left that? I actually kind of like that. It creates sort of a little bit of follow through by warping it like that. So sometimes it works out nice like that. This ball has all the stripes and the different colors and the red dot on it all make it so that you can always tell which way it's facing. So it's a little bit harder of a ball to actually animate, but nonetheless, it's also a lot more fun to animate because you can tell. It gives you a lot more. You can tell what it's supposed to be doing, and it gives you a lot more opportunity to do things like follow through. Looks like I'm making another animation layer. So this is going to be the squash and stretch to help add a little bit of anticipation to the ball taking off from the ground. So once again, just finding the place of where it should be. And I'm on the right layer. Remember to add your objects to the layers. So here we go. I did the same thing where I have my 0 key set. Rather, it's set at 1. So just between here and there. Sorry, between 123 here, between 123 and 152 is where we're going to be working. Everything else is going to be the default of what or not the default, but rather the values of the layers underneath it. Whoa, it did something really funky there. So it looks like the display is having a little bit of a bug with evaluating the expression, the node expression with the animation layers, but that is a correct squash and stretch. It's just if you try and do too much, apparently that it gets a little upset. So it's too much squash. Make sure I set it to an appropriate range. And it's okay to start with too much if you want to initially. It looks like we're getting a little bit off the ground here. I'll probably have to go back and put the ball lower. And I'm going to set the squash to scale Y to above 1, I think. Or just, yeah, I think I should go above 1, but let's see if I do that or not. Yeah, I'm going to do it above 1 right here because it's in the air. Yeah, so what's happening is the layer will let you put scale X and scale Z values in, and that will break the expression. So be very careful with that. That's actually that's bad programming on Maya's side. It shouldn't allow you to do that. So I set the range to pass through 1 on the squash and stretch. I didn't actually set anything at 1. I just set it to pass through 1, going from positive to negative, so that we get a nice fluid squash and stretch elasticity type of feeling in the ball when it moves up. And there I am. I'm setting, and I'm doing it on the same layer. Normally I would encourage you not to do this, but for here this is okay. I'm just setting the translate Y so that the ball stays on the ground at the points that it's supposed to stay. And I didn't set my before and after keys there to block in the range, so I might wind up with by making the scales offset a little bit. Alright, so yeah, I'm copying and pasting the keyframes, and that will actually fix the problem I just talked about. So the scales are no longer, the translate Y won't be offset. Alright, just watching it, seeing how it looks. Not too bad. Alright, so I think I'm going to be baking this down here soon. So this tool right here, this little it's this little box over here that's highlighted. This is a tool from Motion Builder that lets you adjust keyframes in mass. This is a very useful tool. So I'm giving the ball a little more translate in Z and X here, and it's allowing me to edit them proportionally. So you see how the keyframes at the bottom are held still? Well, and I'm just moving them in relationship. I'm moving the top keyframes in relationship to the bottom keyframes that are selected. So this allows you to change values proportionally to one another with multiple keyframes selected, so that you can keep your timing. You can also edit your timing by moving these boxes left and right, and the ones up and down increase the values. It's a very valuable tool. So I just made the ball move in a bigger circle without editing, without having to do another layer. We'll see that tool again later here when I bake the layers down. And it looks like I'm going to do the same thing with the rotation. Again with that tool, I forget what Maya calls it, but it's just the default keyframe tool in in Motion Builder, which is a fantastic package for animation, by the way. So yeah, make sure you select the keyframe with the lowest value that you want to move in relation to, and with the highest value that you want to move in relation to. And it looks like selecting's a little bit funky here. So yeah, we've got the lowest value and the highest value, and then I move them up, and they all move proportionally. So now I get more spin to go with my bigger circle that the ball moves in. I didn't like how small that circle was. There we go. So I made a bigger circle so that the ball has more time and distance to build up the momentum necessary for its jump. Yeah, that gives the impression of the ball moving quicker through its own momentum. Basically, it bounces, and then it lands on the ground, and then it basically does what would be the equivalent of its own run. Runs in a circle, bounces, and then gathers the momentum to bounce for some more there. Whereas beforehand, it was that roll was a little slow for the amount of distance it covered versus the amount of time it took. So to make it look faster, I just made it cover a larger distance for the same amount of time. So what I'm looking at here is, I think I'm looking at the z value in relationship to the x value, and I saw that they were both sitting at the same value. Those two keyframes on z were sitting at the same value, 132 and 134. So I wanted to actually alter that a bit, because that will give the animation the impression of holding or slowing down, which I did not want. So now I'm going to edit that back down a little bit, because that changes things. This, once again, it's that same keyframe tool, moves all the keyframes in proportion to one another. It's a very, very good tool. Doing those kind of edits would take a long time without a tool like that. And there I just condensed the amount of time that the whole thing takes by squeezing them inwards like that. And I decided that was a bad idea. But that shows you what that does. How you can retime the animation as well as change what the values of the curve are. Remember, moving things left and right changes where they are in time. Moving them up and down changes them as far as like what it's doing at that point in time. Another play blast to see how it's going. Play blast, play blast, play blast. Don't trust your viewport to give you accurate information. Make sure you play blast. If you aren't play blasting, you're not getting an accurate view of what the actual timing is. Alright, so it looks like we're going to go down to baking this animation now. So this is something that I do before rendering usually. I try to keep my layers intact for as long as possible. I'm actually just changing rotation calculation method, but I think I go back to that, because you want to basically leave things at their default for the most part. I was trying to I was just checking out some of my options for animation layering. Motion Builder has a lot more of them, and I just go back to by component, whereas it's that by layer is not something that we're really useful for here right now. We might get into that later when we do cycles for characters. But yeah, this is I'm going to merge these down now. And this is basically it's like in Photoshop. You have a bunch of layers in a document, and you all merge it down to one thing. Except this will basically turn all of my animation into there's a keyframe on every frame. So this is a lot different of a type of data to edit, but this is what you get in motion capture. So this is not undoable. And that little motion blender tool I have, where I select things with the range, and it gives me the ability to edit multiple keyframes at once while maintaining their proportions is how you deal with this, right? Having a keyframe on every frame is a different way of working, but it can be done. So yeah, here I am. I'm looking at the he's penetrating the ground there. The ball's going through the ground. Not good. Don't want that. So don't know why I'm looking at the rotation of X for that. Probably don't see that I have the wrong channel selected. But yeah, there's that motion builder tool that shows you how you can. Oh, I'm actually how you edit multiple keyframes. So I've got that big step there, but now I don't. So yeah, I'm looking at the trajectory, and there's a little bit of a step there that I'm pointing at that I don't like, so I'm going to see about fixing that. I'm also going to change the area where the values are the same. And just delete some things so now I get some more continuous motion. And I don't really hesitate to delete keyframes. I mean, you got so many of them. It doesn't. I mean, what matters is that the curve is doing what you want it to do at that point in time. It's got nothing to do with how many keyframes you have or not. Although for a game, you do really want to have as few keyframes as possible for real-time stuff, because this all represents data that has to be saved, has to be loaded into memory, and has to be played back. So the less there is, the less work there has to be done. Just going through, looking at these, seeing if there's any other areas that need to be cleaned up after that merge, or that I decide I want to change layer. It's like, just because you've merged your layers doesn't mean you have to stop editing the animation. You just have to work differently with a different set of tools than you're used to using in Maya. But these are motion capture tools. You learn how to do this. There's a lot of motion capture jobs out there, so it's highly recommended that you learn how to edit animation that has a frame on every keyframe, or a keyframe on every frame. Said that backwards. So I'm looking at this rotation where it flattens out here. I'm looking at the trajectory of how quickly it rotates down, then kind of flattens out, and trying to make a judgment on whether I actually want that. Nope, I actually don't want that rotation. I decided I don't want it, at least for now. But yeah, you see, I'm not precious with it. I don't hesitate to delete things. There's nothing wrong with deleting keyframes. Just go in there, move things around, and make them do what you want. There we go. That took out some of the wobbliness of the rotation. So it kind of does a little bit of a backflip, it looks like. It's kind of neat. And I left one of the animation layers there. You don't have to merge them all at once. Not sure what I was looking at there. Here I'm looking at how the ball squashes before it hits the ground, and this is something that you want to make sure that happens with when your keyframes are interpolating. It will sometimes do this kind of unexpected behavior, right? So we want the ball to squash when it's hit the ground, not before it hits the ground. It should be stretching before it hits the ground, because the force of gravity is pulling it downward, so we want the shape to elongate, and then when it encounters that resistance and smacks into the ground, you want to show all of that inertia and the friction reacting to each other and flattening the ball out. So I think I'm going to do some of that here, or am I? Nope. Okay, yeah, here we go. So I'm looking at the scale Y, which is the squash and stretch control, juxtaposed against the ball bounce. And I'm finding where it should be, finding a midpoint of like where the ball should start stretching, and then I pull up the keyframe to stretch it. And then I'm just gonna make a little edit in the numerical field. And then I think I'm going to use the keyframe editing tool, the mask editing tool, to fix that. Or I'd probably just delete those keyframes. Yeah, I can probably delete everything between there. Nope, I'm going to edit them with the keyframe tool. So that will hold a little bit of a stretch. We only want it squashing where it's contact. So that's looking a little better. I don't think I'd go through and do them all at the same time though. Don't think I take care of that there. We'll wind it up on the end here. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how to work with when you get changes. And this was a pretty big change for this assignment. Getting told that you got to put in a whole nother, type of motion for your ball is not a small thing to ask, but it's not undoable. As much as I complain about Maya, there is a reason it gets used to make movies. It can do the work. You can definitely get it done using Maya. You just gotta not be precious with it. Yeah, so that doesn't look too bad. Frame a better shot for that. Fix the rest of the squash and stretches so that it's not squashing before it hits the ground, and that it's stretching while it's in the air, and that'll be good to go. Alright, I like that anticipation there when it starts to bounce. Looks like I want to just fix something there. I'm looking at something's trajectory, and looks like I'm considering a change. Am I going to bake that layer too?